In Java, all programmings can be broadly classified into three categories: the core programming, applet programming and AWT programming. Now, AWT programming and applet programming, they are alternatively called the graphics oriented programming, or more precisely we can say window based programming. So, here basically we have to develop windows, and through windows the programming aspects can be carried out. Now, today we will discuss about AWT programming. AWT programming, actually we have to see exactly both applet and AWT programming, as just now I have mentioned, is a graphics oriented programming, which is the main difference from the core programming. Now, what is the difference between an applet programming and then AWT programming? So, as we know, an applet is basically a Java program which can be executed through web browser. On the other hand, if we see the core programming, we do not run it using an web browser, rather we can run independently from the console itself. Now, AWT in that sense similar to core programming, that here we do not need any web browser to run a program which is developed using AWT. Now, so this is the one difference. There are many more differences also. Now, so far the applet is concerned, it is basically a small program as we have seen, and usually this small program is meant for internet oriented programming, or more precisely is basically web programming we can say, where the browsers can browse the net and can access their web page, and this web page will usually include applet. So, if you want to design web page, then definitely you can think for applet. However, AWT and core is not in that sense web programming actually, and as you know that applet, whenever we have to design an applet, we usually follow the package applet, where applet class is defined. So, that is why all applet programs are called subclass of java.applet.applet. Applet class basically is an abstract class which we have to inherit for our applet program. It is also alternatively called an instance of a subclass of java.applet.applet. So, this is basically the different way an applet can be defined. However, the core and AWT is not like the applet is as it is mentioned. Now, what an applet can do for us, as we have checked it, using applet, a user can draw any pictures on the interface, I mean graphical input screen, display screen rather we can say. It can create a new window, and this window can be enabled to draw any graphics. It can play sounds, audio, video. It also can receive input from the user through the keyboard or the mouse, but not the input the conventional way that a core program can allow, reading an integer or float or string like this. It only the sense the keyboard or mouse, whether there is a clicked or keyboard is pressed, mouse is dragged like this. And obviously, applet is for internet programming, in the sense that in a distributed environment applet can communicate to another applet to serve the some communication need. There are many more applications of the applet is also there. On the other hand, an applet which has many limitations as well as, for example, an applet cannot write any data into any hard disk, even in the local machine hard disk also. It cannot read any data from the host machine, that means from which the applet is running. It cannot delete any files. It cannot read from or write into any arbitrary memory in any non-memory protected operating system like Mac OS or like this. So, basically applet is heavily restricted so far memory access is concerned, and it basically enables a network connection to host the internet or in other form which it was downloaded. That means, it cannot establish a connection of its own, and it also cannot call the native API directly. If you develop your own API, it cannot use these things. Whatever the methods, those are declared there in the abstract applet class, you can use it, and if can extend, then through extends only it can access all those methods. Otherwise, native API cannot be utilized in this applet, whereas core programming or AWT programming can do. As we see, core programming has many way resembles with AWT programming on the and the difference from the core programming and AWT programming is that core is totally console based. That means, giving input or output whatever it is there from the keyboard or whatever it is there, there is no graphical user interface component, there is no window component, whereas AWT is totally graphical user interface based or Windows based. Now, let us have the more elaborately the different concepts of the AWT that we are having. So, AWT, as we are telling AWT, it means that it is a full form of a big 3 words actually, abstract windowing toolkit. As the name implies, it is basically a toolkit. This toolkit a Java programmer can utilize to develop their own application software, and is an abstract windowing toolkit. It is called the abstract. This is because it gives a line, gives an way how the different method can be utilized. However, time to time user has the flexibility to override that method and can use it is there. So, in usually all AWT programming we can say little bit lightweight programming process, whereas the core programming is heavyweight. If you want to do something, you can develop of your own, other than those are the facilities available in the APIs. In general, so far the graphics oriented is concerned, core programming is heavily heavyweight, whereas using AWT it is lightweight. Lightweight means all methods almost are there, you just plug and play, that is all. That means, you can use and then solve your programming development. So, this is the AWT, and as it is a toolkit, this means that it has lot of packages, and all these packages is defined in AWT package. So, java.awt AWT is the package where all AWT tool classes are there. Now, using AWT what can be done, I have given an idea about it. This is basically a screenshot of a application which is running. While I was preparing the PPT slide, I took this screenshot actually. Now, I made this PPT slides using PowerPoint. PowerPoint is an application software which helps a programmer to develop their slides, presentation slides. Now, here if you see, there are many components are there, many, it is basically a window also. Now, in this window as we see there are many. So, this is basically one view area where the content that user is preparing can be displayed here. Now, apart from this is another what is called the area where it will display some other elements also. Now, here are many other components, for example, here this is there, right, this is all these are basically is a small if the entire is a window, then all these are the small window actually it is there, and every window has its own item. Some items are called the list of items, some items are called the menus, some items are called the choices like this one, and there is also some other, these are called the button like. So, if you click it using these things, corresponding some pop-up menu will appear and it will give other options that by which user can select and can do many things are there, and other things are very similar to the applet look like. So, these are the basically close, these are minimization, maximization, and also and similarly the status bar is also there. Now, this basically is a product of an AWT programming, and this is the product that is used in Microsoft PowerPoint. Similarly, there are many other application softwares you usually use nowadays, those are basically graphics oriented, or we can say more precisely GUI oriented, graphical user interface oriented, and or more precisely based on window programming. So, AWT is basically a window programming which is graphically user interface oriented or graphics oriented. So, graphically user interface popularly called GUI. So, it is GUI, short form is called the GUIs. Now, if you want to have the GUI in your programs, in your software, then AWT is the one best solution that I can recommend. So, this is the idea about AWT, and now the question is that if we want to develop a software, we can that is application software like PowerPoint or Microsoft Word or Paintbrush or something like, then how we can do it? Obviously, we can do it using AWT package. Now, AWT package in fact is a very vast package. It includes a lot of classes and the subclasses there. Now, all the entire packages can be broadly segmented into few categories. The first thing is that there is a graphics oriented components are there. So, it is graphics related packages are there. So, is for example, graphics, and then this is the point, polygon, all these things are basically the graphics oriented things are there. And then there is another is called the component oriented concept is there. So, component oriented concept, it is like these are the component oriented concept are there in this. These are the basically component related facilities, we can say classes, subclasses, all these things are there. And then image related some facilities are there or classes are there. So, image related classes are like these are the image oriented things. So, if you want to process image and everything, then AWT will help with so many classes and others. And then layout management. So, this is called the layout manager in general. So, like this, these are the different layout managers are there. So, this is the layout manager related packages are there. And in addition to this, event is a very important in any Windows programming. Regarding event, there is a toolkits are there, that is the event handling basically by which we can do it. And other than all these things, every packages needs to be very much provide the programmer to develop the robust software. So, error and exception handling, some things are also there in this package. So, as you see, there are so many things are there, graphics oriented, image oriented, component oriented, event oriented, and then others exception handling oriented facilities is provided by AWT. Now, in our discussion, we will try to learn all these concepts in our in this discussion only. We will try to learn all these things. Okay, so applet versus AWT, as we have discussed, it is we have our understanding is, I hope it is clear. Now, AWT, how this is, whether it is a free or not, it is absolutely it is a part of the APIs. Whenever you install JDK, as a part of this JDK installation, the AWT package will be automatically installed. So, it is the part is there, and then you can use this AWT to inherit many other classes, some other classes to solve your problem or the access the different methods, those are there in the package component or classes in that package. Now, AWT is therefore developing graphical user interfaces are there, and mainly the component is responsible to build GUIs. Now, what are the components? Those are very important to learn at this stage, or rather I can say at the beginning stage of your programming learning. I just want to include it. There are many classes it is there or subclasses it is there. I have included, those are related to the component here, like say button, canvas, card layout, checkbox, etc. And like there are many classes also, these are few more classes, and there are many interfaces also, those are things it is included here. Now, so there are many class and interfaces are there. If you want to use AWT, obviously you should need some understanding about all these classes and interfaces and then the methods in all these classes and everything. As it is very exhaustive and elaborate, so it is also not possible feasible to discuss each and every classes one by one discussing their methods, but in my slides I will include all the classes and the interfaces, the methods in them, so that you can have the ready reference from here. However, if you want to learn it, then definitely you have to consult the many other sources which I have already given in my first lectures of introduction. Now, I will just discuss the GUI development using the component that is there in AWT. Component is basically itself a class which is there in AWT, and it has many other subclasses like button, checkbox, choice, frame, panel, label, list, scrollbar, text area, text field, which I have included here. By name itself, it means that what exactly this component elements is can do for us. Probably we have familiar the button. So, if you want to create a button as a graphical user interface in your application, then definitely you have to use this class. Like button, there are many other graphical user. So, these are basically GUI elements, we can say. They can be created for your software, and they can be added in your software, they can be used, they can be developed, and they can be designed, they can be modeled, whatever it is, it basically gives all facilities for the programmer. Now, I will discuss about the component classes as you know. So, first you have to create a component, and to create a component is basically a window, I can say. So, if you want to add some other component into that window, then there are many methods are there which are defined in component class itself. The methods like here add, as we see, add means if you want to add button. So, definitely add method should be there, add then the component in which component you want to add it, and then set size, you can just resize the component, and set layout, a component can allow you to have many layouts. We will discuss about what are the different layouts that is possible for a window, and then set visible, it basically you can sometimes a particular component or a window make it visible, make it invisible, all these things are there. So, methods, these are the 4 methods which are very important methods, and all these methods are defined in component class. We have to just call this method in your program, and then that method has their own facilities. That means, it is a lightweight process actually. Now, first let us discuss about how we can create a frame using our AWT toolkit. And a frame is basically another container, we can say. A container basically and component basically same thing, and applet is also a container. Container means it basically contains many graphical user elements, GUIs like button, checkbox, scroll box, whatever it is there. So, an applet can include all those things. Now, we will see a frame is also similar to this, it can also include many components in it. So, frame is very important one items, important one component which is defined in AWT package. Now, how actually a frame look like? So, here basically we have displayed one frame whose background color as you see with colored blue, and in the top is basically the status bar is a that basically showing that what are the windows are there, and as you know for any windows there is a minimization, maximization, and cross symbol includes that if you want to close this window. And there is a title also, it is showing that is which application is a PowerPoint or Microsoft or whatever the user wants to big it, that this one. So, it basically is a container, and the frame also more precisely it is called. So, a frame has its own title and then some area, and in this area we can include many other components, graphical user elements into it here. So, a frame is typically look like this. Now, let us see how this kind of frame can be designed. Now, a frame if you want to use it, definitely you can call many constructor which is already defined in the class component class, class frame actually. Frame is a subclass of component class. Now, these are the 3 constructor as we have mentioned here. So, details you can just go through whatever the point it is written, I will not elaborate whatever the different constructor it is there. And apart from this constructor, it also has many methods. Those are the methods which here we have listed here, and here is an example, we can check it how we can create a frame. Now, this program is interesting to watch it, and I will just explain this program actually. So, this objective of this program is to how we can create a frame. Now, here we have created one core main program. Basically, we have defined one class called the myFrame class, and the main method we have defined is here, and here the frame is basically created of the class frame. So, and then this is the title that will be displayed here like, and frame resize is basically what is the size of this frame. So, it is 500 by 500 size it is there, and frame set background color blue. If we use it, then it will make the background color like this one. Now, here one thing is that these methods resize, set background, and these are constructor, of course. The constructor is already defined in the frame class itself, but this resize, set background, and here is for example show means the frame will be displayed, is basically defined in the component class itself, as we have already used this class frame. So, by virtue of this, all these methods are accessible to this program itself. So, these are this is the way by which we can just create a frame. So, creating a frame is very simple. We have to use this and then define it, their size, their background if it is there. If you do not do it, the default background is a white will appear, and then finally, you have to show the frame, that means frame is we have to make the frame visible. So, this is the simple way the program can be used to create a frame. Now, so frame is one container as we have discussed. There is another also panel, but the difference between frame and panel, basically frame and panel same. The difference is that a frame has title, whereas a panel it does not have. So, here is an example, the constructor, these are the constructor, these are the methods that is defined, and this is one example by which we can create a panel, and this panel can be included in a frame. Now, obviously, a panel can include a frame can include a panel, and all these things can be floated in a container which is not a frame, not a panel, whatever it is there, that is simply a container like. Now, here this is the idea again, how we can create a panel which basically contained in a frame. So, you can just watch out this code here, again the same, this is the class program that is to create the panel actually, and here you see we have created a frame and we have created then a panel. So, the default constructor it is there, and this is the constructor that is there for the frame, and then this is for the frame resize, set background layout, and this is basically for the panel resize and set background is there. So, as you see, all these things can be managed or controlled using this method, and finally, frame dot add panel, this is important, that means we add the panel into this frame. So, this is the panel and this is the frame, we add this panel into this frame. So, by default it will be there, but again another option will be there, this panel can be placed here or anywhere by deciding other parameter. So, there is a overriding method, of course overloading method, other parameter can be used, so that this panel can be placed anywhere you wish. And finally, once the frame is ready which includes panel, it can be shown. So, this is the idea about how a frame include a panel, or more clearly how a panel can be created, it can be. And likewise, the previous example of creating frame, independently a panel also can be created, but this does not have many use, rather it should be is a part of frame or container or an applet like that. Okay, so, we have learned about how the frame, the panel can be there, and all these container, say maybe applet or frame or a panel, they can include some other components, for example, say button. Now, we will discuss about how a button can be created and how this button can be added into frame or container or in an applet like. So, a button, as you know, it typically look like whatever it is shown here, a button actually it is look like, a button has some label like this one, it has some design style, all these things can be done. So, all these things basically you can do it if you want to have what exactly you want to do, you do not have to do much coding, only just invoke the different methods which are defined in the component class. Okay, so this is the button button, let's see. For the button, these are the constructors, and the methods are also there, lot of methods included here. You can go through these slides and then have the full understanding about the methods, and that's okay. Now let us see how we can create create a button which can be floated on a frame. So this example is like this. So button, if you want to create a button, so this is the standard command that you can follow, and this is the label that button will be. So it is a click like, and set bounds, this methods is basically says that what is the location of the button. This is basically 30, 100 is the this location, and 80, 30 is basically this is 80 and this is 30. This is the width and height like this one. So set bound method is declared in a component class, so it can use it. And finally add b, that means is basically this button class extend frame, that means it will override on the frame itself. So basically include in the frame or content in the frame. So add b means this button can be added into the frame. And then set size, set layout and set visible are basically for your frame. So this is related to the frame, because it is extend frame, all these methods are automatically for this method implies. So this basically the size deciding is this one. And then finally this button demo b, if you created, then this class will be instantiated and the frame will appear look like this. So this is the way the button can be created. Now in the same way, many buttons with different what is called the labels, with different background, foreground, and then different sizes, can different location can be added into this frame. I have included only one example, so that for the illustration only. So this is the button. And then button can be also included in a container, that is a component without any frame or panel. It is like this. It is the same example, like we create a frame F, and this is a button example, and then button B is created, and then all these methods are there. Now here see button example extends component, as the frame is also subclass of this component, so all those things will be there. So this is the one way. Another way of creating button or adding component into your container. Now, so and another also how we can add the GUIs into applet. This example explain it. So in that case you have to develop the class which inherit the applet class, then is basically applet will be there. So applet will be created, and all these method here, for example B1 and B2, two buttons are created, one button having the label, another button without label, and they can be added into this applet and it will look like this. So button can be created, the button can be added into the frame, button can be added into the container which basically is a frame or panel, and button can be added into the applet also. So there are the different way. This is an example that button can be like this button. There are many other component like checkbox and all these things that we are going to discuss quickly. So all these things also can be included in your Windows. Now the checkbox, how a checkbox look like. So typically a checkbox is called like this one. A checkbox has this kind of things, and then there is a label, and then this can be clicked. Or keyboard can be pressed there, and then whatever it is. So this checkbox can be selected. For example, this checkbox is selected. If selected, it will is there. So here we see 4 checkboxes are there, which basically contain in an applet like. Now, so now let's see how the checkbox can be created. Definitely there is a class for the checkbox, and for this class there is a constructor, and for there are some method also there. These are the checkbox method, and this is an example how we can add checkbox into a frame. It is basically same thing the button look like. So this basically 2 checkboxes are created, the C++ and this checkbox is Java. So this is the way the checkbox can be created, and as you have created a frame, so this is basically frame. So this is our frame, and these are the 2 checkboxes as we have C++ and Java, and whenever we make true, so that means a default selection is there, and if you do not make it, is basically there, that will be unchecked like. And then we can add this one. So f dot add checkbox 1, f dot means these are the 2 checkboxes that we have defined can be added into the frame, and finally frame can be resized. So this is the concept by that okay checkbox can be designed, and you can see all these ideas basically same, only the different class correspond to the different class, the different component can be realized. Now label, it is basically just like label is basically a component is like here you can see this is an applet and this is a label, this is a one label. Label means anything that we can write it on the applet, like say gdrawString. If we using the gdrawString, also some label can be put it here, but label is the one class which is there, which is explicitly used for making different label. For example, I can write say first name, last name, roll number, and these are the label. So, first name, last name, roll number we can write, and then some other things can be included there like. So, label is just basically string which can be floated on a screen like. So, now let us see how the label can be created. So, there is a construct, there are constructor here, you can see 3 constructors are there in the label class, and then few methods are also there, and this is an example by which the label can be created. As see, this is basically frame, it is all obvious, 2 labels L1 and L2 are created, and they are redefined here using this one, that means first level, second level. As you see, this is the first level, second level, and this is the set bounds, basically size, that means where it will be placed and how long it will be placed, and then how long it will be. So, basically total width and this everything is mentioned here, adding into this frame, and finally frame is sized. So, this is the idea about how the frame can be label can be added into frame. Text field, this is the idea about the text field. As you see, text field is look like this. So, this is the one text field area, this is another text field area, this is another text field area. So, this is an applet which contains 3 text fields in it. Now, let us see how this text field can be created. Again, there is a class called text field that is defined in the components as a subclass of the component class. It has 3 constructors and then few methods are there, and this is the one as few more methods are also there, and this is an example you can test it how that 2 text field like 2 text field like this one and this one is can be use it. So, welcome to IIT Kharagpur NPTEL Java. So, we just created T1 and T2 are text field, and for every component you see set bound to decide the location of the placement of these elements into the container as well as the size and everything. So, set bounds is always there, and finally, this is the frame should be casted, and then frame can be visible, can be displayed. Now, so this is the way that text field can be created, and text area is just like a text field, but multiple line very long text can be used there, and you see whenever you text area is there, it has the scroll bar automatically will be there. So, you can define everything, and within this thing any text can be put and then display. So, idea of this text area is like this, and for this text area if you want to create the text area, there is a class defined in component called the class name is text area. It has the constructor as we have listed here, and few methods are also here, and this is an example by which a text area can be displayed on this. The method is there text area, this is the class that we have, this is the name of the text area, and then set bound, and then added into this frame, and then frame can be resized. So, this way the text area can be displayed on the screen. Now, list, it is another item, the graphical user interface item we can say. A list typically look like this. So, here 2 lists we have displayed here. This is the one list contains some elements, it is just like text area, but it is called the list. This is another list, and the idea is that we can scroll, we can just hover our mouse to select any one list. For example, here the mouse whenever come here it will highlights, and this basically list is selected we can say. So, these are the example of a list, and the class definition is also there. The name of the class is list. This class has a constructor as it is mentioned here, and then method also, these are the methods are there, and then this is an example which basically shows how the list with 3 items can be created. So, it is the list basically the 5 items. So, that means it has 5 items like, and but although we have created 5, but we have loaded with 3 only. So, 2 more are blank actually anyway. So, we have added 3 items in the list, and they are added into the frame, and then frame is displayed on the screen. So, this way a list can be created, and then choice is also similar to list. So, idea is that initially a choice will look like this only, and whenever you click here, all the elements which is there in this choice will be displayed here, and then you can hover your mouse to go to particular choices, and then we can select that one, whichever the choice is under focus can be displayed here. So, this is the idea about this one, and for this kind of graphical user interface, the class which is there in the AWT is called the choice class. It has only one constructor. These are the so many methods are there, and here is an example about how we can create a choice with 5 elements in it. So, this example is similar to the list example that we can see. We have created a choice, add this choice into the frame, and then frame is ready to use it. So, this way a choice items can be created, and then it can be included in the either it is a frame, or it can be included in a applet, or it can be included any other container itself. Now, here is a scroll bar. We are already get familiar about the scroll bar, but independently we can use some our scroll bar. So, this is the vertical scroll bar and this is the horizontal scroll bar, and then scroll bar has few things are there. This is basically called the visibility portion. This is the range, that means scroll bar will range from 0 to 100. So, if we click here, so whatever the value, say maybe 150 will be the value of this point actually, and this is basically the visible space is called the 60 pixels, and here also scroll bar had width and height and everything. So, these are the elements, that is a scroll bar, and it can be a vertical as well as horizontal. As you see vertical, this is the vertical one, this is the horizontal one. Now, let us see how the scroll bar can be created. Scroll bar, for this there is a class called the scroll bar class in AWT package. It has 3 constructors and few methods are there, and then this is an example, and this example shows how a vertical crossbar can be created. Now, here frame, this is as usual previous there, and scroll bar, this is the instance by which a scroll bar object can be created, and you see the method we have used the default method. If we use the default method, it will automatically the vertical scroll bar only, and no other parameters are there, but here we can define the vertical or horizontal, and then the size, and then visibility and the range. All these parameters can be defined. There are 3 constructors we have shown. Using any one constructor, the different way the scroll bar can be instantiated, and then this scroll bar can be added into the frame can be resized, frame can be displayed. This is basically a simple AWT program that can use the scroll bar, and then you can use it. So, this is the scroll bar that we have discussed about it, and few elements that we have discussed. There are many more elements that we are yet to cover it. So, in our next module we will discuss about many other components, those are very much essential for our AWT programming. Thank you.